welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. We hope that you're going to enjoy the next hour and a half. Going to kick off. We've got a number of different people presenting today, but we have built in lots of time for questions, discussion, and anything that we can't do today, what we'll do is we're going to collect it all in the chat and we will respond later. So whether or not we deal with stuff now or later, we will deal with it. Oh dear me, I'm having technical problems, having had a run through. Here we go. This is what we're going to talk about today. We are going to talk about the Midlands Retrofit Toolkit. And what we're going to do is we're going to work through how it works as opposed to how every individual scenario on retrofit might benefit from this. We're going to talk about the principles of it. So I'm going to hand you over to Ellen, who will talk to you about why we've got a retrofit toolkit.
Thank you, Sally. Hi, thank you for coming today. I'm the Fuel Poverty Project Manager at the Midlands Energy Hub, and I've been leading on local authority delivery phase 2 in the Midlands. LAD2 operates in a different way from previous funding by utilising regional energy hubs with the aim to harness both local and regional expertise. Whilst the primary purpose of LAD2 is to raise energy efficiency ratings of low-income homes, there were additional outcomes. So one of which is to support local authorities to build capability and capacity to deliver large-scale energy efficiency programs, and another to learn from the delivery experience to inform the development and design of other energy efficiency and heat schemes. The hubs have been using the learning from LAD2 delivery to support local authorities in this agenda moving forward. The Midlands Energy Hub recognised a knowledge gap between the technical standard of Pass 2035 and the operational requirements for implementation by local authorities. Given the mandate of Pass 2035 and all publicly funded, we commissioned the Retrofit Academy to produce a toolkit to provide a clear process for all local authorities to follow to help facilitate Pass 2035 compliance. The toolkit highlights key steps and points for intervention for local authorities in order to be well-informed funding clients. The toolkit was developed building upon previously undertaken by the local Energy Northwest Hub, who you will hear from shortly, the Greater South East Energy Hub, as well as other Retrofit Academy projects. The PAS 2035 takes a holistic approach to retrofit and specifies new roles for professionals involved in retrofit projects. With more government funding committed through Sustainable Warmth, as well as 950 million for Hub 2 and 800 million for Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund Wave 2, the aim of the toolkit is to assist local authorities in gaining a deeper understanding of how to develop and manage retrofit projects in compliance with the PAS 2035 process. Finally, I'd like to thank the Retrofit Academy, my colleagues at the Hub, and all of the local authorities that supported with the toolkit development. We hope you find today's session informative, and please do get in touch to let us know if you have any feedback on the toolkit or other potential areas for support. Thank you, Sally.
Thanks, Ellen. I'm now going to hand you over to David, who's the Chief Executive at the Retrofit Academy, to talk about how this toolkit can help with the retrofit challenge we have.
Thank you very much, Sally, and good morning. Just before I start, could I ask everyone who's in the meeting and not contributing to mute their microphones, please? Because it does lead to a lot of feedback, and thank you ever so much. That includes you, Sally, please. Good to see you're not muted. Thank you very much. Fantastic. And thanks for battling against that, Alan. And I'd also like to start with a thank you to the Midlands Energy Hub, the Northwest Energy Hub, and all the other hubs that have worked with us on this project. This has been a huge activity for our team over the last 5 months or so. I think it's when we started. And like all the most worthwhile projects, it's been challenging, difficult, it's led to lots of difficult questions, awkward questions that we've had to find answers for, with the view to sort of saving you as much of that pain as we possibly can. So thank you to those great clients, and also to my team, who really have burnt a midnight oil on this one, to say the least. Now, so I've been asked to just talk about why this toolkit is important, and there are no shortage of toolkits out there, I should say. So the question is, what makes this one different? And fundamentally, it comes down to the fact that we believe that local authorities have a unique and hugely important role to play in the decarbonisation of our housing stock. Now, why is that? As you all know, the government has signed up to internationally binding targets for decarbonisation and tackling and eradicating fuel poverty. And that's only possible if we do deal with the elephant in the room, which is that over 30% of all carbon emissions come from the built environment. The existing buildings, 80% of which that will exist in 2050 have already been built. And when it comes to social housing, 4 million social housing, we have initiatives and plans around that, but that leaves us with 23 or so million homes in the UK that are in some form of private ownership. So it's really, really important that we get residents and private landlords on board with this mission. And local authorities are, I would say, the only viable agencies that can enable that. You're trusted by the people who live in the areas in which you work, and you're seen as a neutral and unbiased participant in that process. So you also have a responsibility for the health and well-being of the people who live in your areas. You work in different kinds of organisations, I know, but many of you have a responsibility for health and well-being of the public. And decarbonising our housing stock also means improving those homes and making them warmer, more healthy places to work, live and work, I should say, but in terms of homes where we live. Now, we recognise in saying that you face enormous challenges. For those of you, there are a few of you on this call who I've known for many years, but for the vast majority of you, retrofit is something that is new and has recently been landed on your lap. So we are well aware, and the starting point for this work was to establish a baseline of where you were. And we found generally that there was a lack of capacity, a lack of experience, a lack of knowledge, and then externally that many of you didn't feel you had a supply chain that you could rely upon. We also recognise that with PAS 2035, the British standard for retrofit that you're all being asked to apply on LADs and HUG and other government-funded programmes, that the standard adds a new layer of complexity. But I think, and I hope by now, you've all accepted the fact that PAS 2035 is vital if your projects are to be not just compliant, but also effective and high quality. So as Alan said, we wanted to give you a set of practical tools and resources that will specifically address that point. So we're not trying to solve everything through this toolkit, but we are trying to give you the knowledge and tools to make the PAS the enabler of the sort of local authority-led housing decarbonisation programmes that we need to see repeating at scale over the next 10 to 15 years, that will lead to this becoming systematic, supporting your supply chain locally, helping you to build a retrofit economy and develop a supply chain, and of course that it is consistent and repeatable, and therefore that we can really scale up around that standard. So I hope that you'll find this a very useful session and a very helpful toolkit, and I'll hand you back to Sally.
No, we're not come off.
Okay, so Ellen talked about the fact that this is a toolkit that's built on some previous activity. Lots of the best work builds on the good stuff that's gone before and learns from the bad stuff that's gone before. We had the opportunity to work with the Northwest Hub, and Marissa is here and is going to talk about 2 previous projects that we did there that helped us inform what we've done in the toolkit for the Midlands. So I'll hand you over to Marissa, and if you just want to let me know, Marissa, whenever you want me to move the slides on for you.
Thanks, Sally. We can move to the next one. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, as part of the current grant funding program, Local Authority Delivery 2, or LAD2, the Local Energy Northwest Hub worked with the Retrofit Academy to provide guidance on engaging and working with retrofit coordinators and assessors. Understanding this was a very new process, we wanted to test out how this would work and what lessons we can draw from it. But we also wanted to consider and understand procurement and contracting requirements of local authorities in alignment with the PAS process. So we completed 2 different phases of projects, and the first one was looking into how we can contract for PAS, and the second was a pilot on site where we tested the PAS process on the local delivery program that is currently underway. So if we go to the next slide. So the phase 1 contract for PAS compliant retrofit allowed us to workshop with different stakeholders, different procurement options for delivery, as well as ask questions on legal structures, liabilities, and indemnity issues that needed to be built into the contract. We go to the next slide. And after a series of workshops, we distilled some of the key questions coming from stakeholders and worked with the Retrofit Academy to answer those. We looked at retrofit delivery model options, what options are available to contract for retrofit coordinators into projects to ensure their oversight and client protection is best achieved. And this was probably the essential question we worked to resolve. We looked at how to reconcile cost caps alongside medium-term improvement plans, at forms of contract, at resident needs and liabilities, and how this all needed to be thought about in the contract and program design up front. And often, testing and challenging how these 2 things work side by side, contracting and setting up the program and delivery of PAS. So we go to the next slide. And as I said, that first question was one of the key things that came out of this, which was different delivery model options for local authorities. And these are obviously too small for you on screen, but you'll be able to be linked to the work today. And we analysed 5 different ways that the project could be set up to ensure that independence of coordinator, and look through different ways that contracts can be procured. So this is online, a downloadable resource. We talk about pros and cons of each model and how it would work with the PAS process. So yeah, some really useful guidance and flowcharts to look there. Thanks, Sally. And then the second part of the project was where we conducted a live test of engaging retrofit coordinators and assessors and walked through the process up to the medium-term improvement plan. We created video footage and recorded lessons learned throughout the process and have compiled a series of briefing notes to pass on this knowledge. So we used an area in St Helens in Liverpool City Region Combined Authorities remit within the LAD 2 program. We looked at up to 40 properties and worked with a project manager who coordinated and reviewed the work and the assessments that were carried out on site. We go to the next slide. So the briefing notes that we produced, there were 5 different briefing notes. One that looked specifically at the pre-program activities, what should occur before customer contact or assessments are being taken on site, and looking at the generic challenges of funding programs and transitioning to PAS, understanding the delivery of this contract, GDPR, the appointment of the RC and setting outcomes and access protocols. So there's lots of really interesting lessons learned in that pre-program up front that you can have a read into in that first briefing note. And then we moved on to the actual assessment on site, what's involved in a retrofit assessment, how it works, and again, the key lessons learned from reviewing the process and walking along on site with a team. Then the next slide. The last 3 briefings were briefing notes that we produced were on the option improvement evaluation, medium-term improvement plans, and retrofit coordination tasks. The customer interface, including roles for, the funding client is different from the landlord client, is different from the resident client, and you'll see this work being brought into the toolkit that will be, part of the Midlands toolkit that will be launched today. And then handover. So how do we ensure effective handover? I can't go into the content any more than that, but it's all online for you, ready to have a look. You'll be able to see these documents as part of this toolkit launch as well. And yeah, happy to answer any questions today. Thanks.
Would anybody like to ask anything of Marissa before we move on in terms of phase 2? It is all online. We can put a link to the web page in the chat, but if there are any questions for Marissa. No. Okay, well, if there are any questions, then please do put them in the chat, and we'll put a link to the web page where you can get all of the briefing notes and download them. Okay, so the Retrofit Toolkit. Lots of this has been mentioned already in terms of building on previous work, working with individuals to find out what the real life challenges are and figure out whether or not what we were proposing would help them. And I see a couple of those people on the call today, so thank you, Tom, thank you, David, for joining us. There are others there, just the people who are on the top of my screen I can see. It's been contributed to by technical experts and legal experts, and we have those on the call today. Dr. Peter Rickaby is here, we've got Colin King also, and then we have our lawyers that are on the call and we'll speak to you later. This has been built with PAS in mind at all times, and what we've tried to do is figure out how you can look at PAS through 4 different lenses. So section A is all about customer. Marissa just talked about the importance of the funding client alongside the resident client, and this is something which is not particularly well understood across the piece, that it's not just the funding client who should have a say. PAS seeks to protect the resident client. So we look through the resident client's lens in part A, and Nicola will take you through that in a moment. Section B is about the management considerations. So if you are the person who's responsible for managing a programme at local authority or social housing, but we've written this particularly for local authorities, then this is what you might wish to look at, and Arnu will take you through how to use the tool in a moment. And section C are the legal considerations. So looking through the legal representative's lens, what are your lawyers likely to want to know and to do in terms of protection, not just for the resident client, but also for the organisation. And then the final section is a technical specifications section, and the author of those, Peter Rickaby, is here, and that's about how to make sure that you specify works that will deliver PAS 2035 compliant work. So I'm going to hand you over to Nicola now, who will talk to you about how to use the customer element. Thanks, Nicola.
Okay, thank you, Sally. Oh. I'll just check. Can everyone hear me okay? I got a little bit of feedback then. Okay, lovely, thank you. So yes, this section A of the toolkit is focused on the customer, or in our terms, the resident client. So that term refers to any owner-occupiers, the homeowner, tenant, residents, all of those phrases that you may refer to your client base as. And that was coined from Annika Kelly of Carbon Co-op, and it just allows it to be more flexible and open to basically anybody who resides in the property that is to receive the retrofit. So this is all about the resident's point of view, the resident client. As Sally said, it's looking through their lens, and it's designed in this way to protect the resident client and empower them to ask the right questions at the right time to the right people, and to be an inclusive part of the process. So sometimes the person living in a house just kind of sees things going on around them, the external things might be getting built up and changed. Sometimes they can lose track of what's going on. So as many of you are discovering also, it's brand new in terms of retrofit and learning all of this. It same applies to the people living in the properties. This is all brand new terminology, processes, documentation that they also need to learn and understand. So this toolkit helps to bring that into a more digestible format for them, and also helps to bring that interaction between the retrofit team and also the people living in the properties. So there are 4 elements to this. So first of all is key restrictions. So that is anything to do with the elements or information that is required careful consideration, or what we would not expect to be discussed. So as part of this section, the key restrictions, which I'll talk about examples in a moment, are things where we would want to avoid any miscommunications, any personal opinions expressed about certain measures. So those are restrictions that we would hold to each type of role within the retrofit process. Key resident client questions. These are questions that we kind of trying to anticipate that the customer would have, so build that consistency and trust from the resident client. So they may have a whole host of questions that you're not prepared for, but also there will be common questions that you will see across the process. So things like who's going to be entering the property, and a few more examples that we'll go into as well. So formulating a standard response, particularly if you're going to be working in a certain area, restricting that word of mouth, that flow from one neighbour to another neighbour saying, oh, well, so-and-so told me X and they told me Y. So having some standardised questions and answers prepared will help to deal with that element of it. Also, key information to the resident client. So there is a lot of quality assurance, there is a lot of documentation and also compliance that is required as part of PAS 2035 and a minimum set of documents that comes with this. So if you're new to this, and some people just don't like documents anyway, they can be quite heavy, and this section helps to understand who is expected to give what documentation to who, and what documentation would then also perhaps be required by the funded client. So all of the information and all of the requirements is to sit with the resident client. So if the funded client would like copies, they would have to ensure that is part of the process. And finally, key information to the retrofit team or the retrofit coordinator specifically. So information that is passed on from one member to the other, so that all parties are informed of the process to make the whole project a success, and just to understand who should be in receipt and take responsibility for things like completion after. Next slide, please, Sally. So this just details a little bit more. It's quite small in the writing, but it is available in the documentation that will be issued today. So the roles that we have are the retrofit coordinator, the retrofit advisor, retrofit assessor, the designer, installer and evaluator. So this table just breaks down some of the key examples of what each of those sections are required to talk to each department, or sorry, each retrofit role. So I'll just use the example of the retrofit advisor in terms of the key restrictions. So we would not expect the retrofit advisor to suggest any retrofit solutions, to discuss any timings or any money saving specifics of the retrofit project. It's important to manage the customer expectations from the outset. Therefore, this initial contact, so the retrofit advisor or whoever is providing the retrofit advice is there from the outset, and to get speculation of measures is to be avoided also. There has been an update to PAS 2035, in particular around the qualification of the retrofit advisor. So the qualification that was set out has been removed, but there is going to be a new requirement and a new qualification that is currently in development and in trial now, and that will be ready for April. And I'm very excited about that, having had some of, in my past, having some advisors go through training, which the training was brilliant, but it was more of a fuel poverty angle. This new training and qualification will be specifically around retrofit. So that should hopefully add an excellent qualification to any teams involved. So primarily anyone can deliver energy advice who is appropriately qualified. So for example, the retrofit coordinator, qualifications such as domestic energy assessors who generally kind of deliver advice in that respect as well. Another example is the retrofit assessor. So moving along, I'm sorry, I'm pointing at my screen. I've got Italian background, so I speak with my hands. So doing online things is a bit restrictive for me. Retrofit assessor. So things that they might expect questions from the resident client. So which rooms will they require access to? How long will the visit take? What happens next? Have you got any ID? So these things that can be standardized, we have standardized responses. And also just to make the resident client feel more secure more comfortable in the processes that are happening, rather than just somebody coming in with muddy boots on and trampling all through the house. If they can answer some questions in advance or whilst they're there, then that can help bridge that relationship from the start. And when someone is entering another person's home, it can be stir up unexpected emotions and questions. So just putting that whole process at ease is a key point from the resident client's perspective. Also, they'll have multiple people going into the property, so using the questions from the resident client can help to analyse that and go forward and minimise the interactions that are unnecessary. Whilst the assessor there can also ask questions themselves of the resident client, so background history of the property, any works that have been done, so they can anticipate any potential additional works that need to be included. Okay, and next slide, please, Sally. So just breaking down those a little bit more into more detail. So in the toolkit, you will get an individual table like this for each part of the process. So there'll be one for the retrofit coordinator, the retrofit advisor, etc. And that goes down into much more detail as to what the key questions are, the key restrictions, the key information. And in this example, I just want to highlight the importance of the retrofit coordinator playing an integral part to ensure the quality and compliance, and their role is an overarching role, bringing together all of the information and making sure the processes are followed and understood by all of the elements. So making sure the installers are cooperating with the designers, making sure the information is then being fed back through the advisor or the coordinator themselves to the resident client. And they also are their key information to the clients is to provide the medium-term investment plans, improvement option evaluations, and risk assessments. So it's a key pivotal role that the retrofit coordinator plays. So they do have a little bit more detail in their example. And then also the key information to the retrofit team. So using the example of the retrofit designer, again, they have a pivotal role ensuring appropriate measures are specified and then communicated to all of the teams. So they need to make sure that documentation they're producing, plans are shared appropriately and also included with the retrofit coordinator. So retrofit can be achieved by retrofit cannot be achieved by measures alone. We need buy-in from everybody, particularly supporting behaviour change and supporting everyone to understand their journey, and their part is key. Without buy-in from the resident client, there's risks of access issues, negative word of mouth, delays on site, and other things that could potentially be impacted. So it's really important that the resident client is on board and understands the retrofit process as much as anybody else that's involved. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Nicola. I'm sure you can see from the screenshots there that there is an absolute wealth of information, and there's one of these for each of the roles, and split down into the four key elements that Nicola described. So all available in the toolkit, downloadable as of after this meeting. So please do make use of it. I'm going to hand over now to Anu, who's going to talk through the management considerations and going to talk about how you manage this as a program manager. One of the things that I am going to do, though, just before I do that, because we seem to still have problems even though everybody's muted themselves, I'm going to mute all and then allow Arne to unmute himself before we continue. So there you go. Okay, Arne.
Okay, hi everybody. Part B of the toolkit, the management considerations. We've tried here to make your projects better and your lives easier. There we go, no small task. That was the brief. So we've tried to strip things back and give you the simplest way to make PAS 2035 work for you, to make your projects better and your lives easier. So a little bit of context. PAS was created to make retrofit better. That's worth remembering. And if PAS is getting in the way of delivering your project, then you're doing it wrong. PAS shouldn't be in the way. PAS is the way. And having said that, of course, we introduced PAS, I say we in the widest possible sense, in the worst possible way, because lots of us had projects which were already underway pre-PAS that then got extended and came into PAS. So we went and we retrospectively added PAS, kind of the exact opposite of the way it's supposed to work. So that gave PAS 2035 a fairly difficult introduction for a lot of you. And I think there's still a need for many stakeholders to adapt to what PAS 2035 means. And that includes BEIS in the way they introduce funding caps to some of the funding programs. PAS will require more comprehensive works in some cases, and the funding caps don't yet reflect that and allow that fully. So still a long way to go to make all of those things work. But we do need to move to a different place where PAS 2035 does become the way projects are done. We recognise that's something of turning a super tanker. So the management considerations section was here so that you could work out which button to press first. So where do I make the most impact kind of to get things started? The management consideration should enable you to go, okay, I don't understand all of PAS yet, but I'm going to start here. And for those of you who have a deeper understanding, you can take a forward step from wherever you are. So there are three parts. A simple touch point list, the considerations narrative, which explains the detail of the list, and then a timeline at the back. Can you just scroll that forward a bit so you can see the pictures there, Sally? If you keep pressing, but there we go. And one more. Super. So context, on the left-hand side, we have the front page of PAS 2035. PAS 2035, including PAS 2030, which is the best way to think of it, is something like 184 pages. And as always with standards, it's part of a framework. So within those 184 pages are references to other documents and other standards. So that keeps pointing you another document with another 200 pages. So we do understand why that can be daunting for those people who aren't thoroughly buried in PAS day after day. So the Retrofit Academy created its process compliance map that exists as a guidance document. It also exists as software. And this is a kind of step-by-step, 217 line items for some of the key roles, the retrofit assessor, the retrofit designer, and the retrofit coordinator. If you go through those 217 line items and you can tick them all off as being done and evidenced properly, you've worked your way through PAS. That's kind of how it works. But that's still 217 line items. And again, for those of you who have been thrown into delivering projects without a deep understanding of retrofit, that still feels like a lot of things to do. So on the right-hand side, we have my touch point list. We're down to 22 things now. So hopefully that's starting to feel more manageable. And although you probably can't read them, you should be able to pick out that 6 of those things are in bold, and they're kind of the very first even of the 22. So now we're down to 6 things. Everybody ought to be able to dip their toes into looking at 6 things, even without the full knowledge of PAS. The process map software is available to all Retrofit Academy members, and the Midlands Energy Hub made all its members Retrofit Academy members. So that's certainly available to all of those people. On we go, Sally. So on the left-hand side is my 22-point list. We don't need to look at the detail of all of that now. It's page 21, I think, in the toolkit. And on the right-hand side is the 6 I picked out as the headlines for that. The first one is within the contracts to make sure that the PAS 2035 roles are all clearly allocated and that compliance to PAS is in everybody's contract. So however you're contracted, everybody needs to have in their contract that they must comply with PAS. So that's one for everybody. And we'll look at 1 or 2 of these in more detail, but picking them out in assessment, I would have a look at how ventilation, condensation, damp and mold is done within the whole assessment process as your first touch point, your barometer for what's going on in the assessments. Have a look at how measures are selected. That's another key area. My favorite, which we'll look at in more detail, is to check construction details in the design. They should exist. If they don't, then things are going seriously off track. Then in the install process, check the design details are being built, and finally check the occupier can use what they've got. These touch points aren't supposed to be any sort of replacement for all of the content of PAS 2035. They're just the places where you dip your toe in the water to check that all the people in the project are doing all the things they should be. So it's your easy access to check, hopefully the most impactful points to check. Sally, onwards, please. So we've given you this list of touch points. Where do they go? What do you do with them? How do you use them? What I've tried to draw here is the most contractually simplistic way of delivering LADS type projects. So top left box is you as the local authority delivering the project. The bottom right box is your single turnkey provider who brings all of the PAS roles with them. So this is the sort of simplest way to deliver projects in contract terms. And it is what quite a lot of people have done, are doing, but it's probably very important to note here that it is not risk-free. You are relying on self-policing if you do adopt this model. The key issues being that the retrofit coordinator and the retrofit evaluator are within your service provider. So they're the bits I've highlighted in yellow on the right-hand side. This is allowed in PAS, but PAS does recognise that it's potentially a conflict of interest, and this is not recommended by the Retrofit Academy. On one, Sally. So this is where the touch points go. In between you and the sort of delivery end. Somewhere in there is where you are, where the touch points need to be. And there are various different ways that you can do this. And if you go on again, Sally. So I think at the Retrofit Academy, we would recommend that you remove the retrofit coordinator from within the turnkey contractor, and they can effectively do most of this for you. It is within that role. If they are truly independent of the contractor installer, then you can have a lighter touch approach in terms of how they confirm, demonstrate to you that the things in the touch points are all happening. If that retrofit coordinator role is within the service provider, then I think you would need to be more proactive in terms of looking at the touch points yourself or appointing someone else to look at the touch points for you if you need somebody who's better qualified. That retrofit coordinator role could sit inside your organisation. They could be independent individuals or retrofit coordinating companies. They could be within managing agents, project managers. Any of those sorts of people could do this sort of work for you, as long in terms of being a retrofit coordinator, as long as they're qualified. But if they're not being the retrofit coordinator, all of those sorts of people could engage in the touch point process for you. Onwards, one more, Sally. So let's just look at an example. So this is item 6.3, which is the check construction details. Again, it's not important that you read it here, just knowing that it exists. I think this is the longest single touch point in the whole section, primarily probably because it was my favorite. And I think it's that after you've contracted, making sure all of PAS 2035 requirements are in the contracts, this will be my next single most important thing to go to, check those construction details. Onwards again, Sally. So within that text that was from the previous slide are bits of information to help you understand what that touch point is, and how to go about looking at it and using it to help to make sure your projects are robust. So in there are references to PAS. Where does PAS say what about looking at construction details? What does PAS say you have to have? It points you at those in case you want to look at those. We've described some of those details. So for example, where solid wall insulation meets a window, there should be a construction detail for the window jamb. It sort of tells you the kind of things to look at. It points at the measures matrix to say, here are some other examples of the kind of things you could be looking at. There's a bit of additional technical information about what it is you're trying to ascertain. And if we take that window jamb, for example, it's thermal bridging details, and then how and what you would be looking for, and suggest a sampling approach. What methodology might you adopt? So if you had X homes, how many of them might you look at, in what order, that kind of thing, to give you a guide to look at how you'd actually deliver that. And just while we are touching on it, so there should be a construction detail for where solid wall insulation meets a window. That should exist. Actually, there's 3 details, one for the jamb, one for the header, one for the sill. All of those should exist. If they don't exist, that should wave a massive red flag that something seriously wrong and some sort of intervention is required. Normally, for most of these things, they will be standard industry best practice details. So most of the time, it's a standard industry best practice detail, kind of over and over again. So it's fairly easy to ask, it's fairly easy to reference. You only need something bespoke where you have something different enough not to fit. So normally, if you think pattern book, that's the way this would go. So easy to ask, easy to check. It only gets complicated where you need bespoke details. Shouldn't be too hard. Onwards again, Sally. So finally, we put a timeline in the back. So at the front, we've kind of got those 22 touch points, but they don't necessarily just happen in a simple chronological order. Some of them are iterative, some of them are things that need checking throughout the process. So we created an expanded, fairly basic timeline just so you can see where the touch points fit into the delivery process. So in summary, hopefully, those management considerations just tell you which things you should consider using to get involved in a project. You might go very deep, you might go very light. Either way, it gives you those clues about where to engage, how to engage, what to look for, where to get further backup, how you might do it, and how many you might look at. Okay, that's me, Sally.
Anybody got any questions for Arne before we move on to the next considerations, which is legal?
Yes, please.
Here we go. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's Dave Sugden from Staffordshire County Council. Just a quick question about, in terms of the people or persons that are doing the measuring of the touch points in that sampling process. I'm just trying to get clear in my own head again, because I think we've discussed it before, but the actual, what kind of, because when it was discussed before, it was sort of, we're not actually evaluating what they do, we're just making sure it's being done. So what type of qualifications, what type of people will be the people doing that, do you think?
There is a section in the toolkit that goes into that in slightly more detail. So yeah. There is this question about whether or not you are checking the homework exists or marking the homework. So especially where you would have a bespoke construction detail, really normally the only people who will be fully qualified to sign that off are probably going to be people like architects who have the retrofit designer qualification required. So most of the time, this is a checking of that the homework exists rather than signing it off. In theory, one of the reasons a lot of retrofits have gone wrong historically is because that design doesn't exist at all. So one of the key things with PAS is to check that it does exist. So when you ask that question, hopefully what should happen is your service provider should just go, yep, here's the standard construction detail for that and a reference of where it comes from. That would enable people, certainly like retrofit coordinators, just look it up and confirm that it is a detail that is out of an industry standard best practice document. So it should be fairly easy most of the time. Furthermore, it means the person designing knows that they are on the hook and it's their responsibility. So it means that what you often get when retrofit's gone wrong is everybody blames everybody else. The installer blames the manufacturer blames the installer. You can't get to the bottom of who it is. The PAS framework should mean everybody knows what they're responsible for. So most of the time, I think most building professionals can do most of this for you. You would only need to get that extra layer of qualification in, probably where you had something unusual or doubt. Does that help, Dave?
It does. It does. That's really helpful. So is in the person that's doing the asking, is the key contact and the retrofit coordinator, they would be asking those questions?
Well, this is where this project was kind of challenging because of structure. So what I think we would recommend as the Retrofit Academy is that you have an independent retrofit coordinator separate from your contractor installer, and then they should be doing this for you. And then you would have to get less involved, because in a very light touch way, they can just confirm they're asking those questions as they should be in the structure. However, there will be people who will want to go for a single turnkey provider for what they see as a simpler contracting methodology, in which case, for example, in the Midlands, you could go to the DPS for the services and specify that you want them to have a look at these 2 touch points. I would suggest the one where you look at the construction details and the one where you look at those details actually being delivered on site. So you can use the touch points to have somebody as a third party to do a simple piece of additional checking. And if you have told your service providers when you are tendering that this is what you will do, then that means that they should all be competing on the right level playing field, knowing they're going to have to do the job properly. And therefore that should dissuade anybody from effectively underpricing because they think they're going to cut any corners. Right, so the very fact that you are going to get somebody else to have a look means people know they're going to have to produce it, know they're going to have to do it, know that it will be looked at, and that they will therefore have to deliver a proper job.
Thanks, Arne. David, I can see you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you. It was just another point on top of what I was talking about. It's specific to the retrofit designer. Now, the PAS says that a retrofit designer is just a qualified architect, construction manager, chartered surveyor, architectural technologist. I think they're the 4 main professions. There's no such thing as a retrofit designer qualification. Not yet anyway, at least we haven't got around to creating one. So it is them having their professional, they have to be a member of the Architects Registration Board or the Charles Institute of Architectural Technologists. That's what tells you they're qualified and competent. Just one other thing to look out for when you're trying to find the right person to work for. Just because somebody has that qualification doesn't necessarily mean that they know anything about retrofit. Not many architects are taught very much about retrofit when they're at university. So probably the ideal situation at the moment is that they would also be a qualified retrofit coordinator or have done some other course that's specific to retrofit. Should just help you find the right people. We at the Retrofit Academy can do some signposting to good people, good designers if you need us to.
Thanks, David. We've got another question from P. Burbage, if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, sorry, my name is Prashanta. Can you hear me all right? Great, thank you very much, David. That was excellent, because that's really is what I'm struggling with. In the turnkey, so I'm from Winchester City Council and I'm the retrofit coordinator. My previous experience is that I've been an architect. What I'm finding is prior to being on board, there has already been a decision to appoint a contractor who is kind of pushing this turnkey scenario where it's a one-stop shop. I'm up against a situation where I'm saying that is not necessarily what PAS 2035 is trying to do. And again, they're just saying, well, as the retrofit coordinator, you can sit outside of the system and we'll do everything from assessment to delivery to evaluation to designing. I'm just wanting to understand, whilst I sit outside of their process, there seems to be a loss of ability to interrogate the design and produce the documents I need to produce in order to fulfill my requirements under PAS 2035, such as the medium-term retrofit plan, improvement options evaluation. I just want to understand if, how does the Retrofit Academy see retrofit coordinators working with designers if it is this turnkey scenario and we're just the isolated person on the outside?
Shall I go first, or are we going to pass this one up to Peter or Colin? I'll go first. In PAS, effectively, whether or not the retrofit coordinator sits with the turnkey provider or outside, the steps are all the same. The things that are required are all the same. The potential danger, and it is recognised in PAS, is that if the retrofit coordinator isn't fully independent, there is the potential for conflict of interest and other pressures to influence decisions that they might make or the way they regard information they have. So if you have a turnkey provider but you are a separate retrofit coordinator, in the process the designer has to send you all the right information. If it isn't there, then it is your duty effectively to flag it's not there, and then things need to stop. You can't just move on and start the installs if you haven't got all the design stuff in place first. So the trick here is to make sure that you are looking at all the things you should be and the information is being provided. I suspect at the moment there are projects where that information doesn't exist. And as the sort of QA process for PAS 2035 gets increasingly robust, some people will probably crash into that. So you can contact me offline and I can kind of take you through in a bit more detail step by step. And hopefully we can use the toolkit to do some of that. But it's that there are key steps identified in the touch points. Those things have to happen because they have to happen in PAS anyway. This is just about making sure they happen in one of the in kind of the most impactful way. So ask these questions first. That doesn't, if you are the retrofit coordinator, you've still got to ask all the questions.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Joe Druce, you have a question?
Hello, yeah, sorry, it is kind of continuing on from this, just a bit of clarification. So I'm a surveyor within a main contractor, and I've done the Retrofit Academy's Retrofit Coordinator course, and also have a kind of decades background in building physics and SAP assessment and what have you. Our opinion is that we're going to be delivering the work, and we're wanting to do the retrofit coordinator part as well as like a project manager role, I suppose, isn't it, really? And our thinking was that as long as we've got an external designer, that takes away that conflict of interest, because as a project manager, you'd be going out to an independent designer and saying, you know, we need you to put together the designs for these buildings to meet the requirements, and then overseeing it and also overseeing the delivery of the work. Is that a decent understanding of the conflict of interest kind of resolution there?
I would go with a glass half full, at least half yes, because then your retrofit designer is the one who should be creating those construction details, which I picked out as sort of item 1.
Yes.
So they should therefore exist, and they should be what you are building. So yes, it's another way of achieving the same thing. If you are the local authority delivering the contract, I think you'd still be asking for somebody, and as long as you're clear in the how you are set up about who it is, somebody should be coming to you and saying, here are the construction details that we've been talking about, provided to the retrofit coordinator by the designer and to me by one or both of those people. So we know that they exist. So it's part of the same process, that you can do this many different ways, and the contracts will be many and various. But yes, that probably would help, as long as I think as the LA, you're doing some checking, just some checking to make sure that people are all doing what they should be. Peter's hopefully not going to tell me off, he's going to add something.
Sure, I'm with you, Arno, no problem with that. I just wanted to pick up that one of the previous questioners raised the issue of the improvement option evaluation and the medium-term plan. And in my view, those are the places where the conflict of interest can be most potent, because the improvement option evaluation is determining what the dwelling needs to get it to 2050 and what the most cost-effective options are. And the medium-term plan is determining what stages that gets delivered in, starting with the immediate stage. And clearly what we don't want, and what the retrofit coordinator needs to be watching, is that the installation contractor is not inserting his or her own preferred measures rather than the ones that the improvement option evaluation compliant with PAS 2035 is identifying. So I think one of the first things as a retrofit coordinator, standing aside from a package design and build type of contractor, I would do is make sure that a compliant improvement option evaluation and medium-term plan have been prepared, and I would want to see those. and make sure that they are compliant before I allow them to move on to the design. And then I think on your points about getting the right construction details start to come into play.
And let's be brutally honest here about what we're talking about. I'm sure this doesn't happen in your organisation, Joe, but our other colleagues could imagine the pressure you would be under if your director comes to you and says, too many of your improvement options evaluations are sending us down the EWI route. We've got teams of air source heat pump installers with nothing to do. They're going to lose their jobs. The company's going to go bust. It's all your fault if you can't find more. And that is the danger of kind of literally what can happen when you have the retrofit coordinator sitting in that role. So that's why it's recognised in PAS as a potential conflict. And it's the thing I think local authorities need to be aware of. There are probably hundreds, or there will be hundreds of these projects happening. So that problem will come up somewhere. It doesn't have to be what will automatically happen in every case for it to be something to be aware of and to ensure that your project delivery is robust against.
Yeah, I suppose it all kind of depends on the integrity of those involved in the project, doesn't it? I know discussions I've had with my directors within our firm is that, the whole idea of background, the whole ethos of PAS 2035 is that you are looking at each building individually and giving it the treatment that it needs to manage heat loss, moisture, comfort in a suitable way, and not just jumping on the right. Well, we've got a mate with the air source heat pump company, So yeah, I suppose it depends on the integrity of those delivering work really, to make sure they're delivering the right thing.
And again, being brutally honest, the reason why PAS was created was because we had retrofits going wrong. So somewhere historically, in some cases, there wasn't enough integrity, training, understanding, whatever it was, to make sure projects didn't go wrong. That's kind of where PAS came from to try and create that. So we're not universally saying that every retrofit contractor is automatically problematic. It's about having a framework that builds in a level of robustness to reduce the risk. And we will also say that, just one other thing, down the track, I think that we will see more kind of upskilled retrofit delivery organizations where the in-house capability is much stronger and that they will automatically work in that more holistic way. So we hope that that recommendation that the retrofit coordinator is independent is something that has a time limited life, because we hope that there will be kind of retrofit companies down the track who really will have all these skills in-house and be able to make that super smooth.
Thanks, Arne. I can see that Peter wants to come back and then we have one more question, but I'm conscious we need to move on to the legal considerations bit. So Peter, if you'd just like to make your contribution and then we'll get Madeline's question and then we'll move on.
Okay, so very quickly, the newly amended version of PAS 2035 does have actually written into it a formal recommendation. The retrofit coordinator is independent. I think actually slightly contrary to what Arne just said, that's likely to become a requirement at the next update rather than being taken away. But I do agree that if the industry can show that it can cope in an honest way, that's fine. The second point I want to make is that behind all of this is the fact that the retrofit coordinator has to have authority. He or she can't be overruled by someone for commercial interest. So if you have the retrofit coordinator in-house, you have to give the retrofit coordinator the authority to make the decisions that PAS 2035 gives them. And that seems to me to be the key thing. It's no good saying the retrofit coordinator is some junior chap who hides away in a corner of the office somewhere and you just tell him what to do. That's never going to be compliant.
Thanks, Peter. Madeline, would you like to ask your question? And then I will take Tom's and then I'm going to close the questions down and we'll take them offline. Madeline?
Yeah, hi, thanks. I'm Madeline from Worcester City Council. I just had a question about where the customer, so the resident customer, fits in with regards to what's required. So we've got a lot of soluble properties in Worcester, and obviously the main proposal is EWI or IWI, and we've had customers that we just don't want that. So how does that then affect, or how do you work around that with regards to retrofitting a property if they just don't want to have that key insulation measure done?
Is this one for me, or is one of our engagement people going to pick it up? Was that you nodding for me? So within PAS 2035, the client has to agree the measures, and in PAS 2035, the client means both. It can be more than two things actually, but crudely here it's the funding client and the resident client.
Okay.
Because we're talking about a range of different LADS delivery type approaches, sometimes that means that the funding client will decide, I'm doing a solid wall scheme. So it may be that the resident client's choice is sort of take it or leave it. If you don't have the solid wall that everybody is recommending, you don't get anything. It may be that you have a far more open range of choices that are possible. So perhaps if the resident says, I don't want EWI, but I do want measure X, and the retrofit coordinator and the funding client and all of the needs of PAS are met by doing measure X, that you can choose to do measure X. So in simple terms, they are part of the process.
Yep.
As the funding client, I think you can decide how much choice they have, whether it's wide open or restricted, but they do need to be part of that process, even if it's just saying yes. And if you're giving them a lot of choice, it does make it harder to deliver these projects, especially where you've got, you know, individual houses scattered across a large area, because it does add that extra level of complexity. The piece in part A of this, which Nicola described, is kind of the gold standard for doing the engagement, and it's about that, trying to get better quality information earlier in the process and more complete information, which should make it more likely that people will accept the measure that you are suggesting, because it should be the best measure for them. If they don't have that understanding, it makes it more likely that they won't go for it. But it's that step by step. So one, they do have to have a choice, they have to agree, and at the other end, hopefully be looking into the section A.
Thanks, Arne.
Thank you.
Tom, your question.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for today. Maybe Arno, maybe Peter, but mine just relates to liability, really, and it might come in the next section of the legal side. What exactly has a local authority provider got in the way of a way of trying to mitigate potential issues that may then come about from a poor installation, or the outcomes not being achieved, or potentially the resident being a lot worse off? We're all going to go through a lot of experience of fuel, energy costs and so on. So if a program's been done by a turnkey provider, they've used the right process, they followed it, the due diligence bit, I would question site. I think one of the ladies mentioned earlier on about the fact that she's not seeing all of the information, or it's not necessarily made available to her. But if the installation then goes ahead and then unfortunately it doesn't achieve the desired outcomes, or the tenants, the residents are struggling with the way the system is functioning and obviously are worse off than they were previously, what kind of accountability has a local authority or a housing provider got then to go back retrospectively to actually physically do something about it? You know, where does that feed into the system, if you can understand what I'm trying to say?
Pete, do you want to pick this one up as you're here?
Hello,
Arno. Talk about passing the buck on. I mean, my view of that is it's absolutely no different than from any other type of retrofit and anything that's been done before. If somebody has done something professionally incorrect or even commercially incorrect during the process, then they are liable for that mistake, and they should have insurance that covers that, whether they be an installer or they're a professional with a role. All that PAS 2035 says is the process that's set out here is one which will avoid that kind of problem if you follow it. It doesn't say there won't be that problem, because clearly there will every now and then. So I would say that the liabilities haven't really changed. People are only liable in the whole process for the bits that they do. They need to be insured to cover the bits that they do, as we'll see in the next section, and they should be held accountable for things that they get wrong. My view would be, if PAS 2035 is followed carefully, that's a good defence for whoever's involved, but it will also be the case, and it's included in PAS 2035, that the evaluation process looks into outcomes that were not as agreed, and that might include Mrs. Smith's fuel bill savings and unintended consequences that can occur. And actually, PAS 2035 compliance requires those things to be investigated and remediated before compliance is confirmed. So there is another layer of protection there in the evaluation process to stop you getting in a position where you're dealing with sort of long-lasting complaint issues.
I think, Peter, my concern is, as much as anything, is that the T's and C's that are coming through from some of the turnkey providers are so onerous, and I'm not saying hidden away, but they are proving to be very difficult to agree, especially obviously as we are signing away our authority to physically have that right to recourse, and that's the concern. And it's proving to be a real problem for us. So actually, physically, we are heading into a number of contracts, and at the moment we don't have a signed contract because we can't agree the T's and C's because of the onerous nature of the way they've been written in the favour of the contractor, and not obviously to manage our interests. So that's the concern that I have, and getting sight of that information that they're processing as well is proving to be a challenge.
Yeah, I think the only thing to say in response to that is you always have recourse because you're the client or part of it, and you shouldn't sign it away. So
not to the moment.
That's what you're being asked to do, then don't agree it, find someone else, because they obviously lots of people in the industry will, with a bad track record of failures in some cases, not in all, will always try and limit the liability by the terms they offer you. So, you know, that sort of scrutiny of proposed arrangements is just as important now as it ever was.
I think it's the timelines, Peter, as much as anything with BEARS and the enforcement that they've got to meet, obviously the funding criteria that everybody's trying to adhere to at the moment. So we're under that sort of pressure, but I do appreciate
I very much hope, you know, we're talking about all stakeholders needing to adapt and learn and develop for past 2035. I very much hope we can reach a point where BASE, you say, right, I'm not signing the contract, where somebody at BASE will look at that and go, here's a responsible client doing a responsible thing to make the world a better place, not here is somebody failing to meet their target. So that's really important, I think, for BASE to get behind, because that will help people to make the right choice rather than being potentially penalised for making the right choice.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.
I'm going to need to move us on now. Just a couple of things. Joanne, I'll come back to you if that's okay. I can see that you've got a question. In the chat, there are 3 questions that I can deal with quite quickly and say we will come back to them. Somebody's asked how to contact on. You can do that through the Retrofit Academy's email address, which is on the webpage that's in the chat link. Somebody's commented around the LAD schemes not being PAS compliant because they asked you to specify measures in the funding application, which Peter, I know, has repeatedly told BASE was not the greatest idea in the world. And then there's a question around park homes. We'll come back to you on that question, and I will come back to you, Joanne. I'd like to move on now to the legal considerations, and we have David and Hina on the call. I'm not sure which one of you is going to take this, but I'm going to move the slide on, either David or Hina, and ask you to talk about the legal considerations and the protocol that you have provided in the toolkit.
Jump in as well, so Sally, we'll do a bit of a double act. Try to
Thanks.
Be less Morecambe and wise as we go through. An interesting point that Tom had raised, and I completely agree with what Peter had said in terms of recourse, not really changing in terms of an ultimate liability issue. But one thing, if it can afford any comfort, where there are onerous provisions, one of the terms that's included within the protocol states that where a conflict exists between a schedule of terms or procedures from turnkey providers, if a conflict exists with that and the protocol is essentially spelling out PAS 2035, that the protocol would take priority. So where there is some form of liability shifting from a turnkey provider, that hopefully that will provide some comfort. Ultimately, it is not a fix-all, nor could it ever be intended to be such. It ultimately hopes, as Arnold said, that everyone does as they should. And look, if everyone did as they should, I wouldn't have a job. So it's the reality that might necessarily always happen. It was said at the start that PAS 2035 generally was brought in, and Arnold said perfectly, to make things easier and better. Most people will balk at the thought that a lawyer would try to do that as well, suggesting that we usually get paid by the word. But we are great believers that in order for the spirit of PAS 2035 to be met, it must be kept in the simplest terms possible. And that's ultimately what we're looking to do with the protocol. Some legal considerations and ultimately a bit of an introduction to the protocol. The protocol in and of itself is a document that flags the key areas of PAS 2035 and the checklist ultimately that is to be adhered to. It does not seek to rewrite or create a scope document. It is a protocol document that will sit alongside a scope, a works information, an employer's requirement, whether they be turnkey, whether it be a consultant or professional that is carrying out any number of roles between coordinator or designer, the like. Ultimately, it's local authorities' responsibility to include the protocol within their contracts. And the way it's been drafted is that it can be a one-size-fits-all. You do not need to amend the protocol, save for whomever we are instructing or whoever you are appointing. But it is designed in such a way and drafted in such a way that it can fit in with any form of bespoke or standard form contract. As I said, it's not a complete protocol, but it sets out what needs to be met, and we do it or have done it in the simplest way possible. Sally, I'll do my Chris Whitty impression if you want to go next slide. Ultimately, there's a few risks that we wanted to flag. These are points of principle and then in application. Principally, why we suggest a protocol is included and why the checklist is met, is that there may be no contractual guidance as to how the works are to be carried out. And in a previous life or looking back, it was often the case that this was never done. And it was after the fact we were realizing something hadn't been done as it was meant to have. And what do we do now? So prevention is the best cure. And part of that is complying with the protocol and using ultimately PAS 2035 in the way it was meant to have been created. Without it, it increases the likelihood of non-compliance, likelihood of failures to satisfy audits, and a likelihood that the works are going to have to be repeated, and that's time and money. So looking at the 3 points of any retrofit project, it's time, cost, quality. We need to get quality met at the first time. We want to do it for the best value for money, and we want to achieve it in a time that is going to cause less disruption and ultimately get the works completed as quickly as we can. When the protocol is not satisfied, or whenever PAS 2035 is not met, all of those 3 things are affected to the negative. One thing as well, from a practical application that we need to look at, is that there may be changes in the next 18 months, and the protocol as is drafted is going to have to be updated, and that's recognized that there's going to be some minor amendments. However, always be aware that at the point a contract was entered into, there will not be any retrospective effect. If you enter into a contract on the basis of PAS 2035 being the appropriate legislation at that point, any update will not then apply retrospectively in such that you could then be audited, fail, or have to carry out remedial or corrective works. We suspect it'll happen in the next 18 months, so it's more of a watching brief in terms of that. As we said, the protocol itself is not a complete scope document, and there are drafting notes that we've kept as simple as possible. So whenever they are to be included, always be mindful that it can't just be a pure copy paste, but it is as close to that we've made it as close to that as possible. I'm going to shut up for a while and let Ina talk a little bit more about the protocol in practice.
Thank you, David. Hi everyone, my name is Hina Shazad. I'm a solicitor in the DWF construction team. So we have, sorry, Sally, are we okay to go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the protocol is to be read in conjunction with PAS and the Retrofit Academy compliance map. It's been drafted in such a way that it is to be inserted into the employee's requirements of the JCT contracts, the works information scope or service information of the relevant NEC contracts, or the services within a consultant appointment relating to the retrofit projects. It is essential to note that the protocol is supplemental to the scope, works information and or employees' requirements. The local authorities will need to set out the specific works to be carried out by the contractor or consultant in each retrofit project. The protocol considers 3 distinct roles, being the retrofit coordinator, the retrofit assessor, and the retrofit designer during the life cycle of the retrofit projects. Each role is assessed based on the level of the risk path. Depending on the size of the project, this will either be low, medium, or high. The protocol is an amendable document, and there are drafting notes throughout which provide options for including or excluding sections of the protocol as appropriate. Next slide, please, Sally. Thank you. Nicola and Anne have kindly discussed each of the roles within PAS. The protocol ties in with these roles under both PAS and the Retrofit Academy compliance map to form a checklist. This slide sets out the categories that are considered under the protocol and the responsibilities for each of the roles as determined by PAS. And I'll just leave that up there for you to have a look at how they've been set out.
Okay, anybody got any questions for the lawyers? This part of the toolkit stands alone, as do all of the other parts, but it is best read in conjunction with all of the other parts, which is the same for all of the other parts as well. So it's a toolkit with 4 very separate tools. They're all usable independently. However, you will get much more value and much more comfort by using all of them. If there are no questions, then we can pass on to the next part. If there are questions that you think about, then you can either put them in the chat or get them to us later. Last call for questions before we move on. Okay, you got off lightly too, you two, didn't you? I'm going to ask Peter to unmute himself and come back now to talk about the last part of the toolkit, which is the sample technical specifications. And there you go.
Okay. The sample technical specifications were developed over quite a long time by people who were expert in retrofit, working for lots of clients, including local authorities and housing associations. They're meant to give you some guidance about how to specify measures. They're not meant to be just copy and paste this into a specification for your project. It's obviously the designers, the retrofit designer's responsibility to design and specify improvements. But what we have done for most of the most common fabric insulation and ventilation measures, although not for heating and hot water measures, is to provide a sort of template, which is a good starting point. So it should allow the designer to build on that and customize the sample specifications to the particular project and the particular requirements of that project as identified by the improvement option evaluation and the medium-term plan, and indeed the assessment. So the idea is to assist the designers, but it will also assist the program managers and the retrofit coordinators to understand the level of information and detail they should expect from retrofit designers. So I would expect retrofit designers to pick up the samples review them in the light of all the other information they've been provided with, and then create their own specifications accordingly. So we've given you specifications for fabric and ventilation. There's also a sample specification for the retrofit coordinator's job role, which might be of use. You want to go on, Sally? You have already. This is the list of the sample specifications in the document, in the toolkit at the moment. And most of that stuff is consistent with current good practice standards and consistent with good construction and architectural standards. However, be aware that technologies change, good practice changes, and so on. And I would still expect the retrofit designer to be in touch with what works and what doesn't, what's good practice and what isn't, and to make necessary modifications. I've been responsible for quite a lot of this material, and it has been changing as we've gone along over the last 5 years, as people think of better ways of doing things. A very good example would be how you fix a new window in a wall with external wall insulation, and the specification will say put the new window in the plane of the insulation, not in the plane of the wall. That might provide some issues with guarantee providers for the window, but actually people have been inventing new techniques for fixing windows in the plane of the insulation rather than in the plane of the wall, and there are now products that you can use for that. And I think we actually modified this particular chapter of this specification to cover that, but I'm not entirely sure. So that's where we are at the moment. Happy to take questions. So in each one, there are standards that each type of product should meet. There's a process for doing the pre-installation survey, which the installer is required to do. There are legal requirements that must be met if there are things like requirements for planning permission. There are suggested materials, but the suggestions for materials are by no means exhaustive. And there are continuously new materials being invented or being brought to market, so that the list is not exhausted. There are some specifications of qualifications that the installer should have. Those are mostly references to PAS 2030 competencies that come from the annexes. And there also need to be, there are also included in their specifications of what guarantee certificates or warranties must be provided, although they tend to be generic. They don't say you need a requirement, a warranty from this particular supplier. They say you need a warranty that lasts this long and that's consistent with whatever the constraints are. And then finally, of course, the specifications all should be saying what the outcomes are that we're expecting to achieve. And those might be things like U values for walls or U values for roofs, or there might be something slightly different. So the kind of overwhelming point here is don't just cut and paste. They're not intended to be to take all the work away from the retrofit designer. They're intended to give the retrofit designer a starting point to customize their designs in accordance with the assessment, the improvement option evaluation, and the medium-term plan, and indeed the agreed intended outcomes with the various types of client. But they're also intended to give the retrofit coordinator a view of what good looks like, a view of, so if the retrofit coordinator isn't an architect or a designer, give them a feel for the sort of thing they ought to be looking for in the specifications. And I think that's probably enough from me on that.
Okay, thank you, Peter. We've got a couple of questions that were in the chat, and we've got Joanne, who very patiently sat with a hand up, and I moved us on. So Joanne, would you like to ask your question now? I'm not sure which part it relates to. Oh, maybe Joanne's doesn't want to ask her question anymore. Peter, there was another question in the chat. I'm not sure whether or not you'll be able to answer this. Is there any assistance in terms of park homes and how to treat park homes?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. I was never a supporter of park homes being in the PAS anyway. They were put in by Bays at a very late stage and included as a single measure, so the whole of the park home has to be done. all sorts of difficulties are emerging with park homes, which are a very high risk type of dwelling to retrofit because of the metal construction and things of that kind. Very high risk of deterioration, condensation, rot, corrosion, and so on. And so not a good area to go. There is technical guidance being prepared for bays about retrofitting park homes, and that technical guidance is supposed to be consistent with PAS 2035. Last I heard, it had been rejected by the energy efficiency industry as not adequate. And so I'm not sure of the status of that guide anymore. It's not in the current list of technical guides that have been produced by various people. So I think it's somewhere in a state of argument or whatever. There are issues around park homes, like on most parks, there are minimum distances between the park homes. And if you put external wall insulation on 2 adjacent park homes, you no longer comply with the minimum distance, which is part of a fire regulation. So I would say take very great care at the moment until this Bayes guidance comes out, and it should be soon. I would take very great care in trying to do retrofit on park homes. The other point that's been made to me several times is that in many cases, the value of the retrofit exceeds the value of the park home itself. So it makes you want to question why you're doing it. But that's just perhaps an anecdotal view. I don't think I can say any more about that, really. It's a very difficult question.
Thanks, Peter. We've got Dave and Tom asking questions again. Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question before I open it back up to David and Tom? No? Okay. David, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was just in relation to the bit about the template specifications, really. And it was mentioned that it wasn't something to cut and paste. I'm just wondering how you would you refer to it within tender, the actual contracts or tendering documents, in terms of how would you reference it if you wanted to? Is it sort of a boilerplate, or is it just something that's guidance for RCs?
Well, actually, although we said don't cut and paste it, I think we meant don't cut and paste it as it is. It's meant that the retrofit designer might copy it from the toolkit and edit it appropriately to the dwelling, the client, the outcomes, the assessment, and so on, and then come up with a spec. So that would be the way I would see it being used, and I certainly wouldn't see it being referenced. I don't think the technical specifications we've given you are such that you could just point at them and say, do it in accordance with Chapter 7 of this. It requires some more thinking. It's in the spirit of what PAS 2035 sets out to do with retrofit professionals, which is to get them to think about what they're doing rather than just applying standard approaches all the time.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Before I move to you, Tom, Kath has asked a question. She wants to come back on the park homes issue. Can I ask you briefly to come back, Kath? I'm just conscious of time.
Yeah, hi. I don't know how to turn my camera on, so hopefully you can hear me. That I'm not on the Zoom anyway. I haven't used Zoom for a bit. So basically, yeah. So we've done a few park home schemes. Absolutely appreciate the high risk nature of the dwellings. Most recent one we did, we essentially retrofitted with fire safe board attached to the timber frame, and then put a fire safe EPS system on top. The fire regulations that you mentioned are rarely a problem in my experience, because essentially as long as you're using sufficiently fire safe element systems, then it's the 5.25 metre distance. Well, all our park home sites, the majority of them have that there. Completely don't understand how you can do a one. So we've just been doing external wall insulation. As far as I can see, there's no way you're ever going to get the 3 elements done, and I don't know why it was done like that. I suppose my biggest point is that these are people who are often elderly, frail, fuel poor, living in substandard homes. Either there needs to be a compliant retrofit solution, recognising it's high risk, or there needs to be another solution. We can't just say they're difficult and ignore them. So yeah, so that's my point really.
Yeah, Kath, I completely agree with that. I just think that past 2035 isn't the vehicle, and that it was, park homes were stuck in at the last minute inappropriately. We do need proper guidance for park homes that deals with the technical issues and the other issues. I did notice, looking at the new amended version of PAS 2030 a couple of days ago, that the insulation of park homes has been taken out of the title of the installation PAS 2030, even though it's still dealt with in the in PAS 2035. I think we just need to get better guidance, would be my view. I wouldn't be comfortable doing retrofits of park homes, but it's encouraging that you've said that you've been looking at and coming up with technical solutions to the sorts of things we've identified. So clearly, with a bit of thought, it can be done properly and carefully and safely. But I think the guidance isn't up to speed yet and isn't available yet.
Thanks, Peter. Tom, one brief question, please.
Okay, yeah, thank you. It's Tom again from Warwick District Council. Whether it's Peter or Arno, I'm not sure on this one. It relates to EPC certification and the benefits and the interpretation by the industry, because my question really relates to the fact that a previous EPC coordinator or official had been out to a property, ascertained what that asset needed to bring it up to certain, whether it be B, C's, D's, etc., and then obviously made the recommendations therein below on the actual certificate, which is fine. The question really comes from the tenant's ability to also understand that document, and they ask the question, well, you're doing a piece of work now as part of a turnkey provision through, whether it be through Lab 1, Lab 2, etc., and it actually doesn't state on the recommendation at the bottom the work that you're doing is actually would be a benefit. It mentions EWI, it mentions IWI, it mentions solar, PV, and so on and so forth, but it doesn't mention the particular measure that you're now putting forward as a local authority. And I just wondered how that now feeds in to the whole system based on the criteria of choosing properties based on their EPC rating and not necessarily on some other factors that may well feed into that. I just wonder what everybody's thoughts on that was.
I mean, I suppose the thing that we all acknowledged in the development of PAS 2035, indeed in the HM Counts review before it, was that EPCs are not really adequate. The way in which improvement options are evaluated is technically very poor. The banding of EPCs is inappropriate. For instance, EPC band C is SAP 69 to SAP 80, so it goes from fuel poverty to just about affordable warmth. And so my feeling about it is that we ignored EPCs in the development of PAS 2035 for those reasons. And actually, we now know that EPCs are being reviewed by what used to be called MHCLG, it's called DLUH or something now. And there is a process in hand, which I think might take a year or two, to improve them. I've suggested that they think about dividing the bands into smaller bands, the way they have in most of the other European countries, to give us more granularity. There's still the problem that because the improvement options are evaluated in a different way in PAS 2035 from an EPCs, they will come up with different recommendations. And so there is a communications issue there in saying to Mrs. Smith, I know your EPC says this, but we've done a really detailed assessment. And remember that an EPC assessment takes about 20 minutes, but a really detailed whole dwelling retrofit assessment, including the ventilation and historical significance and all those things and occupancy. And we've now come up with a different and more accurate or more appropriate set of measures. So my instinct at the moment would be to defend the PAS 2035 process in the hope and potentially knowledge that the EPC process will catch up in due course.
I might be wrong here, Peter, but should they also not be qualified to be retrofit assessors in their own right as well? Should they not go through the training?
Harmonizing the EPC assessor with the retrofit assessor would make lots of sense. That's an issue for the certification bodies, because what they did was they took the DEAs, the domestic energy assessors who do EPCs, and said, we will upgrade you to become retrofit assessors who can do PAS 2035. One would hope that in the review process for EPCs, that would be acknowledged and the upgraded qualification would become what matters. I think that might be politically quite controversial, but that's obviously the right way for people to go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you to everybody for all of your questions. I'm going to assume that's a legacy hand there, Dave. We're coming to the end, and quite a few people have had to leave. It's just a little flag here to say to the people from the Midlands Energy Hub area that we will be asking you, how have you used your Retrofit Academy membership? What projects have you got ongoing? What more might you need our help with? In terms of what are the next steps. So we will be coming to you for that. And at this point, I'd like to hand back over to Ellen to draw us to a close. Just 9 minutes over time. But Ellen, if you'd like to say any final words.
Thank you, Sally. Just to reiterate what I said before, so thank you, Retrofit Academy, for all your hard work, and do let us know if you have any feedback on the toolkit or any other areas that we can support with around this agenda.
David, do you want to say anything before I close the meeting?
No, it feels a bit like that Lord of the Rings film with 10 endings. No, I think it's been great. Thank you ever so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you to Sally for organising, and we look forward to supporting you further.
Thank you. Anybody who needs us, you can find us by going to the Retrofit Academy's website and just email us through the general email, and it will be directed to the right person. Thanks very much. Look forward to you reading the toolkit. It's available to download now. See you later.